Greetings and welcome to the third of 4 chapters on the principles of design. This one, chapter 11, balance and rhythm. Alexander Calder's Little Spider is a sculpture, quite elegant one at that, and it stands up on its own. It occupies three-dimensional space. It has actual balance because it stands up in the real world. Horizontal balance is visual weight that's distributed along a horizontal axis, perhaps the horizon itself. In this particular painting by Degas, we see primary subject elements, rider and horse, other riders and horses, grandstand area, and finally here in the distance, we've got the woods. The distribution of elements is asymmetrical, but the visual weight of all of them tends to balance the picture, kind of like a teeter-totter on a fulcrum point right about here. This horse and rider, big, dark, carry a lot of weight, balanced by this one to a certain extent, but this big triangular shape right here, roughly a triangle, that adds weight to this side. These guys balance out weight on the other side, and then there's kind of an even distribution of weight across the middle. Altogether, the painting feels balanced, asymmetrically balanced, but along the horizon line. Vertical balance doesn't refer more or less to gravity, maybe in a more conventional sense, but the distribution of visual elements above and below the horizon line. In this particular case, we've got the cityscape down below, but this drapery figure that sort of bridges the horizon line starting below and then going up into the sky and then making a big gesture towards the left adds more visual weight to the sky or upper area of the pictorial plane and balancing the elements that are below the horizon line, the city. Diagonal balance, as the name implies, are subject elements and their weight arranged along some sort of a diagonal axis. In this particular piece, we have two couples, a realistic couple down in the lower right-hand side. They look like they're full of joy. And then in the center here, a little bit up and to the left, a cartoon couple. And they look a bit happier, maybe dressed in fancy dress or wedding attire. Well, we associate similar subject elements together, in this case, humans. And despite the fact that the order of man to woman, woman to man, realism to cartoon characters, graffiti sketched here, it doesn't matter to us. We associate them, and that produces a very strong sense of diagonal balance. Also kind of interesting are the way certain other forms mimic each other. In particular, this rectangular form of the wall right here, where these subjects exist, kind of mimics the rectilinear frame of the entire picture plane. This is an obvious example of diagonal balance, even though it's very asymmetrical in terms of the subject matter. Great California painter Wayne Thiebaud with his exaggerated landscape of San Francisco, and he's playing with the verticality, but pushing it, abstracting it to a certain extent. So we have all of the information in the upper left-hand triangle, and of course that roadway basically bisects the entire picture. And the left triangle, it contrasts with the lower right triangle, which maybe it's just supposed to be concrete, or I'm not exactly sure what. Thiebaud doesn't spell it out clearly for us, but it's just a big dark triangle, and the kind of absence that's there is heavy and counterbalances diagonally around the roadway, the cityscape in the upper left-hand triangle. Radial balance obviously has to do with the fact that the focal point of the picture is typically in the center and that elements radiate out from that center or appear to radiate in towards the center. This is an uncommon situation in art, generally speaking, but very common in nature. Think flowers. And if you ever have a chance to see a painting or paintings by Gary Lang, go see them. This is a fairly mesmerizing photograph, I think, but in person, they really mess with your eyes and your brain. Fantastic stuff. This Russian movie poster also is an example of radial balance, but not because the center is a point and circles that sort of radiate off of it from the very, very center. You have circles of text, inner one bar of text here, and then one that runs out like this, and it sort of forms a spiral as it centers in towards here, and that's complemented by the three-point perspective of the buildings. Notice the edges of the buildings, they all kind of come towards a vanishing point, which is right here, slightly offset from the center of the circular motif here to here, but nonetheless, the tendency, the feeling is that everything is sort of coalescing right around in the middle of the picture here. So radial balance, absolutely. Couldn't resist an opportunity to get our man Fred into the show. Symmetrical balance talks about one side being a mirror image perhaps, or near mirror image as the other side. Usually there's an imaginary dividing line that's vertical. In the case here of Da Vinci, vertical line bisects the human figure right down the center, and this side here is similar to this side over here. It's not perfect because of the way that Da Vinci has represented the form, with the pose being a little bit different left or right, but you get the point. Bilateral symmetrical balance is technically when one side and its opposite side are exact mirror images of each other. And at first blush, the Chateau de Chambord appears to be bilateral symmetrical balance. When we look carefully, though, we see that it is slightly different from one side to the other. This wing over here has a different arcade, and the tower structure is a bit more ornamented. Here we have 4 arches and a different configuration in the tower, but much of the central portion here split down the center, hence the way the photograph was taken, dead on perpendicular to the front of the chateau, is that one side and the other is very, very similar, even if it's not technically perfect. Perhaps more interesting and usable a form is approximate symmetrical balance, in which you have fairly similar one side to the other side, in this case left to right, split down the center, but not exactly the same, with interesting and important variations between one side and the other. Rufino Tamayo is one of the most famous of the Mexican artists, perhaps eclipsed only by Frida and Diego Rivera. And in this particular piece, we see within a unified field here, 2 humanoid forms, heavily abstracted, facing each other, arranged on the left and the right side of an imaginary division, pretty much right in the center of the piece. But there are significant differences between each one of them in terms of their basic shape. Notice the shape of the head here, different through the chin area, skinnier, a little bit wider, small differences, the color, the green against the more bluish form here. So united in the fact that they are representations of human form, but possess enough differences from one side to the other that we say, well, they are different. So approximate symmetrical balance. Another example from Latin America. In this case, fairly obvious, I think, what's happening here. Human form in the center. On the right-hand side, the jaguar, a symbol of the New World. On the left, the bull, symbol of Old Spain. And the title Mestizo referring to the blending of culture. So we have the center axis running right through the middle of the human head, and then elements on either side which are fairly balanced but different. talking about a theme. Interestingly enough, it's the negative space that really varies here, where the plants are arranged in kind of a dynamic, diagonal sort of thing with a lot of energy. And that's really the biggest divergence from the symmetrical balance in this piece. William Wegman has been photographing Weimaraner dogs, pets, for many decades now. It was sort of a funny subject matter when it first started off, but he's been taken quite seriously as time has rolled on. This piece shows the incredible delicacy and sophistication with which he arranges visual weight in the picture plane. At first blush, you think that it is more of a sort of bilateral symmetrical balance, but then you quickly begin to pick up on differences between one side and the other. First indicator, clear dividing line right through the center, but this is reddish, warm, and this is more of a blue-green, cool. The dog here, two different photographs of the same dog. You can see from the eye position and from the general pose that the dog is photographed at different angles, and then it becomes even more sophisticated. On the right hand side, you've got the dog in fairly naturalistic color, very dark against a lighter value negative space. Dark has a feeling of greater weight, light has less weight. Over here, the negative space area is a little bit darker, but the dog is sort of shrouded in the same red mist here, and so doesn't have quite the same visual weight, plus doesn't project out into this area with the same amount of mass as the right-hand side. So without this area here, which is the right-hand dog's form, barely indicated, this side here, imagine this is gone. The side on the left would feel a little bit paltry because so much more of the dog is shown here. But because Wegman left in this portion, the extension of the right dog's body, it adds that little extra weight asymmetrically, but it balances the picture. Pretty good stuff. Asymmetrical balance, obviously where left and right are very different, but somehow because of the content of the work or the visual flavor of the elements, we end up with a sense of balance. This is a really interesting example because on the surface of it, you would think the strength of this big dark tree trunk and this radial form right here of the grate that shoots out with this pattern around here, that carries a lot of visual weight. And here is a kind of horizon line, even though it's not a true horizon, and the pattern of the bricks is fairly constant from one side to the other. What balances this picture is the fact that it was a long exposure and it captured this guy walking, ein Fußgänger in German, and only the foot and bottom of the pant leg are frozen as it was planted on the street as the walker was moving along from right to left. Because this is a blurred capture of motion, that draws our attention to it because it's not static and humans are programmed to see motion. Think savannah, don't get eaten. But also, we recognize that this is human action. And remember how egocentric we are as a species. We're attracted to what other humans are doing. So even though it only kind of takes up a little bit of space here, we recognize that it's motion and human motion, and it balances the heavy visual weight over here of the tree and the grate, producing a kind of asymmetrical balance. Asymmetrical balance comes in many different styles and forms. This particular one is primarily balanced with the use of light and dark values, and we see it in the geometry of the architecture here. We also see it in the fact that the two girls, one girl that's closest to us is visually larger because of her closer position, but she is darker values because she's in the shade. The other girl is actually a larger person, older person, but she is in light, and so her light dress has lighter values. So the light and the dark, all of that here with the interesting geometry of cast shadows and openings in the buildings, light and shadow, produces a very complex study, an elegant study showing asymmetrical balance, primarily using value. Two more interesting examples. On the left, Deborah Butterfield, American sculptor. In this case, the horse form, which is very common and recurring motif in her work. And notice that it's built out of a collection of scraps. She collects timber and metal and has this huge boneyard of stuff that she uses for her sculptures. So here we have the horse, which is fairly massive in the main body area right here. But as we move through the elegant portions of the neck, through the head, the jawline, through here, it's only like a little armature, and there's not even enough continuity to figure out the form here. Our mind fills it in, this little nub that sticks up and represents an ear. So in this sense, they're asymmetrical because a portion of the body is treated quite differently than the other. But our tendency to sort of fill in the principle of continuity again allows us to understand what the whole form represents, even though it's actually quite imbalanced. But our brain takes care of that deficit. On the other side, Degas again. Very extravagant arrangement of flowers here. It takes up most of the picture plane. And then the woman is sort of tucked in over here on the right margin, actually creeping off the edge of the painting itself. So asymmetrical composition for sure, but remember, we are egocentric and we love life. So the woman, even though she doesn't occupy as much space as the flowers, is human and is kind of prioritized a little bit better in the back of our brain that organizes these things. That way, we get an asymmetrical balance that works. In fact, I might even argue that the balance is tilted a little bit towards the right. The woman almost overbalances the flowers if you look at it just right. This is the work of fabulous American painter Richard Diebenkorn. And this painting is balanced in such complex ways that we could talk about it for half an hour and probably not run out of fodder for discussion. Let's talk first about color and value. In particular, we're talking about dark blue and light blue. So here's where all the dark blue is organized, framing elements, geometric elements of the lighter blue. Kind of there. And then the seat right here. Of course, the blue changes a wee bit here and there, but light blue, dark blue. So value and color scattered about in arrangements that are kind of like puzzle pieces or building blocks. And the visual weight of these elements is scattered about, so it does produce a kind of balance. Of course, these are dark areas, so value, not blues against light, that kind of mimics the dark blue, light blue element that exists in the rest of the painting with this sort of dark neutral and slightly warm light value there. We also have warm elements that are positioned throughout the painting. They're typically horizontal, but there are some important diagonals. This band of yellow here, band of yellow here, band of yellow here, little bits of verticals there, and then the diagonals of the chair. The subtlety of these bits of warm that are a counterpoint to all the blues, the coolness of the blues, and where they're orchestrated and split out, boom, boom, boom. It mimics the diagonal pattern of the chair itself, moving from here diagonally to there, to there, to there, and off this page. This is the work of contemporary American artist and Los Angelino Susan Logorecki. Riot Hyatt, that's the Hyatt Hotel in Hollywood that was made infamous by bands like Led Zeppelin for throwing televisions out of the windows, etc., etc. She's taken Riot to a different level here and applied it to visual conventions, producing asymmetrical balance, that seems rather imbalanced, doesn't it? Think static and dynamic. Balance and imbalance. On the left, we have an extremely interesting and controversial picture by Shirin Neshat, Iranian artist who was about to enjoy a really wonderful retrospective in LA before circumstances cut it short. So we have elements in the picture, a kind of symmetry between left and right, foot, seen from the bottom, with this unexpected but extremely beautiful calligraphic script poem that is lettered onto the bottom of the feet. All of that speaks to balance, harmony. The barrel of the rifle protruding between the 2 feet sort of disrupts all of that, coming from left, headed towards right. So yes, many elements of balance, but the incongruous nature of this rifle barrel poking through there disrupts the balance and produces a sense of unease, which of course was her intent. On the right, the extremely famous picture by Robert Capa, Death of a Loyalist Militiaman, referring to the conflict, the Spanish Civil War, which also inspired Robert Motherwell's elegy to the Spanish Republic. Some people say that this photograph was faked or staged, and that perhaps Capa witnessed a scene like this. He most certainly did, but then went back and staged this photograph in order to maybe recapture the memory of something that he hadn't actually photographed before. Who really knows? Nonetheless, the image itself is a picture of imbalance because, for one thing, on the picture plane right here, the right-hand portion, if it's divided in half, appears to be just a landscape, and kind of a nondescript landscape at that. Now we have the soldier. The militiaman is supposed to have been shot and is reeling backwards. He is off balance himself. The pose is all about imbalance. And then imbalance in the sense that bucolic scene here is imbalanced by the fact that death is taking place over here. Dramatic, dynamic imbalance. It's the point of the picture. Rhythm is usually thought of as a musical term, but it certainly exists in the visual world as well. And here we have regular repetition, in fact, a very regular repetition by American modernist Donald Judd. Every single one of these rectilinear blocks is absolutely the same, mounted at even intervals, and so it's knowable. It is regular. It is predictable. A very common device of minimalist artists. Certainly Judd employed it throughout his entire career. Alternating rhythm can be thought of to a certain extent as variations existing within a theme or a motif. And here we see that employed a couple of different ways. It's Dome of the Rock, Temple Mount, Jerusalem. And starting from the bottom, you have a series of arcades right here. The arcades are very similar in their shape, but within each one, color changes and the geometric design changes from one to the next. But there is recurrence from this one to its similar one here, 1, 2, 3, 4 bays, whereas this one here is repeated only 2 bays apart. So the rhythm is alternating between 4 and 2. We have a similar situation taking place around the rotunda here, where you have similar panes repeating, and these panes repeating, but there is a variation. The color changes between this one, then you have the green-yellow based one repeated there, and back to the blue-oriented one here. Finally, to a lesser degree, you have a motif, this diamond pattern here, and it changes direction, and is mimicked here in these panels. Progressive rhythm, or organic rhythm, well, this may be a case of made-up terms on the part of art historians and theorists, maybe to help sell another textbook. However, the phenomenon is real, and here we see it in the steps of the cathedral. And so the idea is that the rhythm of the steps here, as it changes on the journey, it evolves. Because of distance, they become smaller, spaced closer together. Their shape changes as you move from foreground through middle to deeper space. We have a similar situation where the fluted columns right here, it's a motif, fluted column, but because they step down here and they change their width from right to left, it's kind of an evolution of the form. This is a photo collage by the great British Californian artist David Hockney. And in this piece, he's taken a series of Polaroid pictures, and then collaged them together in order to recreate, well, it's basically multiple exposures, isn't it? So he's recreated this street scene, and it's largely coherent because we understand that it's buildings next to a road, next to a sidewalk, and trees in winter. That part is fairly regular, but closer inspection shows us that there are pieces that are missing, and we see this interesting geometry produced by the bits that weren't captured in the original series of photographs taken. And we have elements that don't line up. The top of the roof line right here kind of jigger-jaggers along a little bit, produces irregularity. We even have an area where the color didn't work right and the film was developed incorrectly, and it produced this kind of blue-purple over here, which, well, it's a variation. The mind loves these little things. It makes it interesting. If it was just bump, 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 that's predictable and too regular. It's like the checkerboard squares. Once you've seen it, you know it, and you get bored. You need variations. These variations are what makes syncopation so exciting in the world of jazz music, which is exactly what's happening here in Hockney's photo collage, and it provides a nice outro for us on Chapter 11, Balance and Rhythm.